Good afternoon, pilot teachers, and good afternoon, students. Thank you. Sit down. Okay, we're going to continue on with our work on looking at Java, and I'd like us to make reference to information on page 5 and onwards on our booklet on Java. And today we're going to look at a little bit more on the land use on the island of Java, and we're going to look at some of the words which are associated with farming or agriculture, and that is basically looking at what we call intensive agriculture, comparing it together with extensive agriculture, as well as arable farming and pastoral farming. But before we go ahead to doing or to looking at those terms to do with land use in Indonesia, especially on Java, I'd like us to be reminded that our work in geography covers 3 very important parts that we have already looked at: physical geography, we have the skills, and we have human geography. Okay, for the part on what we have covered on physical geography, some of the subtopics that we have looked at are to do with landforms. We had looked at climate, vegetation. Okay, and for the skills, it's mainly to do with mapping skills. Now for the section on human geography, we are covering the part on human geography by looking at the case study. And you have to note that some of the subtopics which are very important that we are going to look at in this particular subtopic, of which they will be topics on their own in grade 12, will be that of, first of all, farming. And when we look at farming, it is mainly to do with agriculture. A lot of times when we talk about agriculture, people think that it is to do with growing of crops, but that is not true. When we are covering agriculture, it is to do with both growing of crops and looking after animals or rearing of animals. Another word we can use instead of agriculture is that of farming. So for our work on Java, we'll be also looking at land use and mainly farming in Java or on Java. Other subtopics which come under human geography is that on population. And for the work on population, it's going to be looking at words or terms like growth rate, birth rate, death rate, population density, population distribution, and etc. Those will come together with the work on population. Another subtopic that we must cover when we are looking at human geography will be that of migration. And here basically we'll be looking at the push and pull factors which contributes to the movement of people. On Java, we are going to also learn that the capital city of the country Indonesia is located on the island of Java, Jakarta. And we're going to also look at some of the reasons why people are migrating into that area, Jakarta, more than the other areas. Okay, so migration is another important subtopic. Then we also have resources. And for the work on resources, when we look at Java, we're going to look at, beside agricultural products that are produced on that particular island, are there other resources like mineral resources that are also available on that island and also in that country. Very big topic also will be that of urbanization. And for urbanization, we are looking at towns and cities, or the growth of towns and cities. What are some of the problems that are experienced in towns and cities? What are the advantages and disadvantages of living in towns and cities? So these are some of the subtopics that we will be looking at under human geography. So we're going to look at farming and agriculture now for the work on land use Java. And on page 5 of our booklet, some of the information that are given on page 5 of our booklet is very brief, and I would be expecting you to do some note taking so that any other information that is actually not mentioned here, you are able to make note of to go with the 2 cross sections that you were asked to complete for your homework. Okay, I'd like to go back to looking at the readings on page 5, just below the information or the word Java. So I'm going to read through now, and then I'm going to go through some explanation on land use and the different agricultural practices on that particular island. We already found out that Java comprises of 60% of the population of Indonesia. From our booklet, we will find out that Indonesia, when this book was actually published, has a population or had a population of 180 million people. Papua New Guinea, from the last census, with the estimates that were given, Papua New Guinea has approximately about 4 million people. Indonesia, 180 million. That's from when this book was published. If we look at information from maybe the internet, you're going to find that population for Indonesia in 2000 is 228 million people. Okay, out of that total population, 60% of the people of Indonesia, they live on the island of Java. That's more than half of the total population of that country lives on that one island, which is Java. Therefore, when we look at generally the natural vegetation of that particular island, Java, much of the tropical rainforest has been cleared for agriculture. Why agriculture then? Agriculture is very necessary in order to cater for the needs of the large population that is there on that particular island. Because we have, from the readings here, it tells us 60% of the total population of Indonesia lives on Java. Let's do some quick calculations here. If we know that when this book was actually written, this booklet here, when it was published, if the population was 180 million people, and here we are saying 60% of 180 lives on Java, what would be the total number of people that lives on that island, Java, in Indonesia? Okay, someone with an answer? Would you like to tell us, please? 60% of 180? Ebony, what is your answer?
$108 million people.
Okay, so here we are saying that on that island of Java, there is 108 million people living there. You think about what we have done on mapping Indonesia. You can compare Papua New Guinea with the whole of Indonesia. We are not looking at 108 people in the whole of Indonesia. We are looking at 108 people living on Java, that one island, one of the main islands in Indonesia. Okay, if we have the updated information today, like I've mentioned, about 228 million is the population now. If you maybe have access to the internet and you can get that information, you can work out what is 60% of 228 million. Approximately, we're looking at 136 million people. So on the island today, 136 million. Therefore, agriculture is very important. So let us look at how agriculture is actually practiced so that we are able to also work out how these people are able to feed that number of people that are living on that island. We have already found out that generally the physical structure of that island is made in such a way, or it is in such a way that we have the young folded mountains in the center of that island running right from the west to the east. The green color shows that. The blue areas are the alluvial lowlands. The alluvial lowlands will also be some of the fertile lowland areas in Java. So those areas would be most intensively used for agriculture. And then we have the yellow color areas, of which they represent the hills and the plateaus. And because this area is densely populated, or there are so many people living there, they would have to make use of every available land. So the mountain areas and also the hills and plateaus are also used for agricultural purposes. We had a cross-section, that is what you should have copied into your exercise book, looking from the south of that particular island of Java to the north. You would have found out now that the southern area, which is where Indian Ocean is, the coastal plains are a little bit narrow and irregular. They are a bit more steeper. You come to the high areas of Java where the volcanic areas are located. This here will tell you also that perhaps the soils that are found in the valleys would be fertile enough for growing of crops to take place. Then as you come towards the northern part of the island, you have the coastal plain, which are wide and fertile. So a big area here, wide and fertile, which means a lot more people would be concentrated and also using these areas for growing of their crops. Some of the land use that we also looked at from the cross-section, you were asked to make note of yesterday. The fold mountains and the volcanic areas, which are the high mountain areas of Java, the main land uses would be that of rice growing, rubber, vegetables, tea, and coffee. I hope you have made note of that also from your diagrams that you were asked to construct into your exercise book. The hills and the plateaus. The hills and the plateaus are mainly for lumbering, especially of teak. The alluvial lowlands, which are the flatter regions or areas, that's where we have rubber, palm oil, cocoa, sugar, tobacco, coconuts, and rice grown intensively. And finally, where the coastal margins are, you expect fishing to be the main agricultural activity along that area. Okay, we continue on with our readings. And then from the readings there, you can see that most of the tropical rainforests which are on the island of Java have been cleared for agriculture, and it is actually divided, the land use is actually divided mainly between rice growing and plantation production of sugar, tobacco, and tea. Rice production must or it has to be intensive, and the intensive growing of rice is mainly on the alluvial soils of the northern plain. And also rice growing is intensive on the fertile, basic volcanic soils of the highlands. When we look at farming, already I have explained to you that farming is to do with farming is to do with the growing of crops and the rearing of animals. In our booklet there, it tells us that rice growing is intensive on Indonesia. Intensive is one of the words that we can use to describing a category or a type of farming. Farming can be divided into many different categories depending on the type of activity that takes place on that particular or in that area. Farming can be intensive. The opposite of intensive will be extensive. Okay, farming can be intensive, it can be extensive. If we are growing crops mainly in a particular farm area, then the type of farming will be referred to as arable farming. Arable to do with crops. If you're growing sugarcane, coconut, tea, rubber, etc., they are to do with plants. So any farming of plants, it's mainly arable farming. If we are farming animals, then what do you think would be the term that we use to describing that type of farming? If growing of crops is arable farming, what do you think is the farming, or what is the term we use to describing the farming of animals? Livestock could be correct, yes. Livestock is possible, but I'd like the word to be associated with arable. If I said intensive, the opposite is extensive. Arable, what would be the growing or looking after of animals be referred to? Livestock is definitely correct, but I'd like the term similar to what we've done on the work on arable. No? Domestication, we have the right idea there, but that's not what I would want to make note of, or for you to make note of. Okay, pastoral farming. Heard about pastoral farming? Pastoral is to do with mainly the rearing of animals or the looking after of animals. So if you are looking after cows, ranching cattle, maybe sheep, lamb, etc., then the type of farming is pastoral farming. If you are growing crops, then it is arable. Say, for example, if we have a farm that is both pastoral and arable together, then what is the term that we use to describing the type of farming? Mixed. Thank you. Someone has said that. And then we also have mixed farming. And mixed farming will involve both pastoral and arable on a farmland. So you might have the corn or maize grown, as well as looking after of pigs. You might have the wheat growing, and you might also have the sheep. The wheat and sheep may be together on a farm. Or you might have maize or corn and pigs together on a farm. So you have both animals and plants being actually grown or looked after in a particular farm. Then we have mixed farming. Okay, we look at Indonesia, especially Java. Rice growing is actually intensive. So when we talk about intensive, what are we making reference to here? Dorothy, what do you think when we are describing or talking about intensive farming? What are we actually making reference to here?
Continuous farming in the same area.
Continuous farming in the same area. Perhaps she's correct. Anyone else would like maybe to try give us what we think or what you think intensive farming is? She says it is continuous farming in the same area. Possible, could be correct. What are the rest of you thinking? You thinking the same like what Dorothy has come up with? No? Okay, Gideon, what do you think is intensive farming? Or what does it have to do with?
Massive.
Massive, definitely you would be correct. You're saying massive in the sense of large. Okay, possible. Anyone else? Val? No? Okay, there are three important. I'm going to give you some information now about intensive farming. There are three very important components that you must remember when it comes to farming, especially describing intensive farming. Massive is definitely correct. Here we are looking at the ratio between three factors of production. And the three factors of production are land, labor, and capital. We're leaving out the entrepreneur because for the entrepreneurs, you need that to actually run the farm. That's the managers or the person's skills and knowledge. But these three are very important when we're looking at intensive or extensive farming. We're looking at the ratio between land, labor, and capital. For a farm to be described or for agriculture to be described as intensive, land is usually small. And from that small area of land, there is a lot of labor. Okay, labor, so many people working on the small area of land. And capital, for the intensive farming, capital can be lots or it can be less, depending on the type of farming that is actually taking place. Say, for example, if you were in a developing country of the world, how can you describe capital on a farmland if it is intensive? It will be less. Capital will be less. A lot of labor will be actually required, especially in the developing countries of the world. How about if we lived in the developed countries of the world? How can we describe capital? A lot. There'll be lots of capital required or needed because here they're looking at technology and they have access so they can use the machines to do most of the work out in the farmland or the field. So that's why capital will really depend upon whether we are in a developed country or developing country, that's one, or two, capital will depend upon what type of farming you are carrying out in that particular area. So therefore, land, for it to be intensive, is small, labor, a lot, or a lot of people working on the farmland. Capital will really depend. Okay, now we come back to rice growing in Indonesia, especially Java. It tells us there that rice growing is intensive. We already know so many people live on that island. Land, not as many to cater. Density would be very high. Therefore, whatever little plot that these people can find, they farm on it to cater for the needs of the people. There'll have to be a lot of labor working on the farm in order for production, especially the output of rice to be high to feed the population. And here, because we are using a lot of labor, capital is really not required. That is not to say no capital at all, no. You will need things like the knives, etc., which is a capital, to help you You will need the hoes and the digging spades and etc. to help. But capital is not intensive for the rice growing. It's mainly land and labor, which is the main thing we look at. Small area of land, a lot of labor working there. Finally, from that agriculture comes the output. And the output then would have to be rice. And if we are doing intensive farming, a lot of labor, how can we describe the output? Do you think it's going to be high or low? We need it to be high, yeah, because we are catering for a lot of people. So the output is actually high. That's what intensive is, or what intensive means when we're looking at that passage from the reading. Let's look at the opposite to intensive. What do you think would be extensive farming then? It's still to do with the ratio between land, labor, and capital. The entrepreneurial skills we don't require because those would be what the managers or the farmers would have in order for them to run their farms. How can we describe the extensive farming with land, labor, and capital? How can we describe land? Okay, large area, good. How about labor? It will be less. And how about capital? Capital will be, okay, maybe more or less depending. In most cases, for the extensive farming, it will be capital intensive. In other words, a lot of capital is required. Can you give me an example? Let's say an example of intensive we've looked at is rice farming. Can you give me an example of an extensive farming activity that you know of around the world? What would be a type of farming which is an example of extensive? Large area of land, less labor, but a lot of capital required for production and also processes within the farm. Mason, what do you think? Give me an example.
Wheat farming.
Wheat farming, good. Okay, you look at wheat, maybe we're using our imagination now. We think, if you were maybe in the United States of America, you have wheat farm, perhaps on the prairie grassland, and here we're looking at hectares and hectares and hectares of wheat growing. One farmer, how does he manage to ensure that his wheat is actually well looked after in that hectare and hectare of land? Maybe he's on the horseback, riding and checking around his area where wheat is grown. And he might also have machines, a harvester and a planter. So one machine that helps him to harvest the whole crops that he has, and he also has a planter, that machine that will plant hectares and hectares of land. So just one farmer can do that job. Why? Because it is capital intensive. So that then is an example of extensive farming. If we go down to Australia, we look at Australia, perhaps another good example would be cattle ranching. You allow the cows to, or the cattle to actually roam around. You have one farmer on the horseback, and he's there checking right around how the cattle is actually doing on the farmland. That is extensive farming, and another example. Okay, we move on. We note also rice is an example of arable farming also. Why? Because rice is a plant. If you have to give an example of pastoral farming, then already you have sheep, you have cattle, you have lamb, you also have pigs, chicken, etc. All of those to do with animals, then they will be pastoral. And then we have the mixed farming where we can have a crop that goes well with an animal in a particular farm. Okay, let's move on to the readings. The other readings from the bottom of the two cross sections in your booklet. It tells us that on Java, half the small farms are only about 1 hectare in size. So if you're thinking, what is 1 hectare? A hectare would be about the size of a rugby pitch or a rugby field. So we are going 100 meters by 100 meters by 100 meters by 100 meters. So that's how maybe big the farmers are able to actually use that particular land for growing of their crops or for planting of rice and harvesting and consuming. If a family is to be supported from such a small piece of land, then cultivation on that piece of land has to be intensive. With the Green Revolution also, rice growing in the Southeast Asian region has actually been really improved. Once upon a time, it will take you one whole year for you to grow rice, and you harvest one crop of rice. That means perhaps 3 months at the beginning, you prepare the fields. The next 3 months, you start growing or nursery and growing, and then the next 3 months, you allow the plants to grow. And finally, maybe towards the end of the year, you harvest and you have one crop of rice. With the Green Revolution, improvements in farming techniques and methods has allowed different hybrids of rice to actually grow, and those hybrid of rice allows them less than 1 year to actually grow. So now, instead of harvesting one crop of rice only in 1 year, the people in the Southeast Asian region, including Indonesia, are able to harvest 2 crops of rice in 1 year. So the first 6 months they harvest, and then the next 6 months they harvest all in 1 year. It's called double cropping. Finally, or very recently, there is already been practice of 3 crops of rice in 1 year. So they have 4 months for the rice to be ready, the next 4 months for the next lot of rice to be ready, and the last 4 months, so you have 3 crops of rice in 1 year. See what the Green Revolution has done. It has allowed for the hybrid plants to enable them to grow more quickly, so that production and growing time is shorter, but production is higher to cater for the needs of the people. Finally, from the information on the booklet on page 5, it tells us there that the major problem for Indonesia is feeding its rapidly growing population. The population growth rate, as when this book was actually published, was at 2.4%. That means every year the population grows at a rate of 2.4%. And much of the food must come from the intensively cultivated land of Java. Activities for you to complete for your homework. We have discussed intensive, extensive farming. There are also words which appear from that particular page, words like alluvial soil. And your task then for homework is to see if you can complete those 3 activities that are given on page 5 of the booklet. For the meantime, let's look at some other information to do with land use and farming on the island of Java. Let's not think that rice is the only agricultural product or crop that is grown there. If you look at this map, there are a couple of other crops that are grown beside rice. The grain farming, mainly rice, the orange color on the map there, you should be able to pick up. Those are the rice growing areas. And there's also maize. Maize does grow well also on Indonesia or Java. And maize is actually shown by the lighter orange color on our map here, these sections here. Okay, then you also have some crops which are grown there, specialized commercial crops. If they are commercial, that means the crops are grown for sale. If it is not going to be for sale, then what type of farming will be practiced? The opposite to commercial will be subsistence, yes. So the type of farming, it can be intensive, farming can be extensive, farming can be arable, it can be pastoral, farming can be commercial, farming can also be subsistence. Okay, so some of the some of the commercial crops then, rubber, the areas in blue, the light blue color there, you can see some of the rubber growing areas on Java. There is also sugarcane that is grown on that particular island, the lighter green color representing the sugarcane areas. And finally, we also have tea grown on Java. And if you look carefully, most of the tea would be grown in the highland areas of Java. The pink color or the purplish color there to represent the tea growing areas. And don't forget, we also started off at the beginning by looking at forest. Much of the tropical rainforest or the natural forest of this particular area here has been cleared for cultivation. And what is remaining are the ones that are in the darker green color that you can be able to work out small patches of those on the island. So where there are the forest then, what type of activity do you think would be common in the forest areas? It will be lumbering, yes, or logging. That's where most of the timber would actually come from, exported or used for building and etc. Okay, so don't think that rice is the only crop that's grown there. There are also many other crops beside rice grown on Java. Look at this map here. The map there is supposed to show mineral production. And mineral production, generally of Indonesia, and it also includes the island of Java. Okay, so we've covered already some of the main islands of Indonesia. The key here will represent some of the minerals that are found within the country Indonesia. We're concentrating on Java. And if you look at Java, the yellow color here tells us that these are areas mainly where rice cultivation is common. So you can see most of Java, the island of Bali, Lombok, Timor, and etc., those Flores Islands, most of them have used up their land for rice cultivation. And that is not to say that there are no minerals found on the island of Java. There are also some minerals found on the island of Java. And that map should be one to help us identify some of those minerals. We're talking about intensive rice growing, rice cultivation in Indonesia. Here's an example of how rice is actually grown on the hilly part of the country. What is the term we use to describing the type of landform or landscape that they have used for growing rice then? The landform? Or the type of practice that is actually used here on the mountain slopes or the hills? Yes? Luisa? Luisa, if not Luisa? I thought I had you give an answer. No? Doreen?
Terrace.
Oh yeah, definitely. These are terraces that are actually built. And the terraces are like step features that go up on the hill to make use of every available land on hill slopes for rice to grow. So that's an example of rice cultivation in Indonesia using terraces along hill slopes or hillside. Okay, we have there the process of planting in rice cultivation. And we said that growing rice is actually intensive. A lot of labor is actually required for the processes involved in rice growing, harvesting, and etc. In our next lesson, we are going to look at some of the processes that are actually involved in the cultivation of rice. But this is just a photograph to show labor intensive in rice farming or growing. Okay, looking at vegetation and land use, these maps here represent some of the land uses as we've discussed already. The lighter orange color there represents the cultivated areas. Here we can see most of these areas which have been cultivated mainly for rice growing. The darker orange color then represents the cultivated land mainly where rice is dominant. So you can see all this area where rice growing is dominant. The blue color shows us the forest and the jungles. That means the forest which is actually not yet destroyed, remaining of the natural vegetation on that island. And then we have the dotted key or symbol here represents shifting cultivation being practiced. Shifting cultivation is whereby you farm on a particular piece of land, you leave it for some years for the soil to gain its fertility, then you come back again on it. Meanwhile, you move from one place to the other to farm or to grow crops. And there is also evidence of plantations on the island of Java. And the strokes or the symbol with the lines across there represent some of the plantations. Plantations in this area. Here is another area with plantations, this section and that section also, even at this point here. Okay, and in our next lesson, we are going to actually look at mainly rice growing in terms of the wet rice or paddy or sawa, as it is called in Indonesia, and the dry rice or the dry paddy, which is called tegal in Indonesia. And we'll look at that in our next lesson. Okay, with that information, that will also bring us to the end of our lesson. Class, your homework I've given already, and that is on page 5, defining intensive farming, alluvial soil, and also extensive farming, and giving some examples of those. If you can stand up now, please. To the pilot teachers, our keyword for lesson 143 is Padi. Good afternoon and thank you, students.